All right, folks, we're going to get started. The first thing I'd like to do is have our three presenters introduce themselves. And I'm going to start with our president, Alan Hoffman.
Thank you, Chuck, and welcome to all of you who are here. My name is Alan Hoffman. I'm president of the American Friends of Lafayette and editor of the AFL Gazette. And I got my entry into Lafayette from the farewell tour by reading a book which mentioned it, which I'd never heard of, even though I took a ton of early American history courses. I wound up translating Auguste Levasseur's Journal of the Trip, the 1824-1825 farewell tour, and here I am.
Thank you, Alan. Now I'm going to turn it over to Diane Shaw.
Well, good evening, everyone. We're so glad to have you with us. I am the Emeritus Director of Special Collections and College Archives at Lafayette College. I retired in 2019, but was at Lafayette as the college archivist and head of special collections for 34 wonderful years. And of course, one of my major jobs was caring for the Marquis de Lafayette materials that the college owned and adding, and eventually I got to add to the collection. So I came to Lafayette because of my job, but I consider it a very lucky break that we had such a wonderful figure to study and materials to help elucidate that. So I'm delighted to be here this evening.
Thank you, Diana. We're delighted to have you. And now, last but certainly not least, Lloyd Kramer.
Hello, everybody. I'm Lloyd Kramer. I'm a professor emeritus of history at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. I first came to Lafayette by being an assistant editor of the Lafayette papers at Cornell University in the late 1970s. And I went on to write a book about Lafayette called Lafayette in Two Worlds, which was published in the 1990s, late 1990s. And I found that Lafayette is like a relationship that once you get into it, it never ends. I thought I would leave it several times, but like very special relationships, I've always come back to Lafayette. So I'm very honored to be here with people who are also in a relationship with Lafayette.
That's fantastic, Lloyd. Thank you so much. And we're going to get back to Lloyd and Diane in a minute. But for now, we're going to start our program with our president, Alan Hoffman. And I'm going to bring up, he has some slides that we're going to be looking at. So I'll bring that up right now. Let's see here. And Alan, I'll have you take it away, please.
Okay. So first, I want to talk about the origin story of this book and the symposium that preceded the book. Chuck, could you do the next slide, please? The original
I did it.
There it is. The original idea for a Lafayette Symposium during the bicentennial was to hold it in Manhattan, where Lafayette visited Columbia College on September 7, 1824, the day after his birthday dinner on September 6th. Thus, it was on the wish list of the New York City Bicentennial Committee, chaired by Susan Joy Minker. However, we needed sponsorship. We applied for funding from several foundations, private foundations, and we were denied. Then Susan, who grew up in Connecticut and is a proud alumna of Fairfield University, where her grandfather had been a founder and at one point chair of the Board of Trustees, stepped into the breach through her contacts with Fairfield, in particular a man by the name of Philip Eliasov, art history professor, event planner, and special assistant to University President Mark Nemec. Through Susan's intercession, Fairfield University agreed to sponsor the symposium. Not only did Fairfield fund the presenters, but it also provided the venue, produced the beautiful program. I don't know if you can see this, but you'll see a resemblance between the cover of the book and this wonderful program that Fairfield produced. And they arranged for C-SPAN 2 to record and broadcast the all-day conference. That certainly would have been enough, more than enough. But the AFL and the presenters wanted to publish the lectures to reach a wider audience. Fairfield agreed to fund half of the cost of the publication, and Susan and her husband, Mark Minker, generously funded the other half. And as they say, the rest is history. I want to thank two other AFL members, Governing Board member Jan O'Sullivan, who both edits and lays out our AFL Gazettes. She did a spectacular job in putting this book together. Finally, I also want to give a shout out to Claire Lehman, whose company, Davco, printed the book. Claire was a pleasure to work with and generously donated the ISBN for the book. Now, if you take a look at the cover of the book, you see that wonderful design. The cover art is by Chris Nasham, Senior Design and Digital Print Senior Director of Design and Digital Print, Fairfield University. And we thought it was spectacular, so we asked for permission to use it on the book, and permission was given. The next slide is the frontispiece of the book. Chuck, next slide, please. So this image of Lafayette, which we liked very much, is found in another publication of the AFL. In 2024, we raised funds to have translated a book, General Lafayette's Journal to the United States of America in 1824 and 1825. And this frontispiece was in the book, and it's by Charles de Lasteyrie, who may be a relative of Lafayette's son-in-law. But we like this image very much, so we included it as the frontispiece. Now, each author had the right to select one image to illustrate his lecture. So the next slide is the image that Lloyd Kramer selected to illustrate his lecture, Historical Narratives and the Multiple Meanings of Lafayette's Life. It is of John Quincy Adams, which is appropriate because Lloyd, in his lecture, says, and I agree, that John Quincy Adams' eulogy at the end of 1834 set the tone for popular remembrances of Lafayette. The next slide illustrates the lecture given by Dr. Robert Rhodes Kraut. In his lecture, he emphasizes the importance of the Lafayette Papers project at Cornell that Lloyd just mentioned. So the two images here are Dr. Stanley Azerta, editor-in-chief of the project, and Dr. Kraut, when he was a postdoc at Cornell University. And Dr. Kraut is one of the co-editors of the Lafayette Papers project. The next slide illustrates the lecture given by Paul Spaulding, Lafayette's Power as a Political Prisoner, and it shows the Olmütz prison where Lafayette was held in Austria for a good part of his imprisonment. Paul is the eminent authority on Lafayette's incarceration and the author of Lafayette, Prisoner of State. And in this piece, he focuses on the role of a free press, particularly in Hamburg, in keeping Lafayette's imprisonment alive in the minds and hearts of his friends in England, America, and in France. The next slide illustrates Mike Duncan's lecture, Lafayette's Second Act, 1814 to 1834, and it is, of course, an image of the monumental portrait in the U.S. Capitol, the original of which, by the way, hangs at Lagrange in France. Mike was very impressed by Lafayette's stick-to-itiveness and the fact that he didn't just disappear in starting in the twilight years, what we would call the twilight years of his life, but he continued his work really until his death. And that's the theme of his essay. Next slide, please. In the afternoon session on human rights, I led off with Lafayette and the anti-slavery cause to ameliorate the condition of distress. I chose this image, which I saw at an antique show and ultimately acquired. And it's an engraving of Wendell Phillips, a great orator of the abolitionist movement, and an autograph in which he paraphrases a statement attributed to Lafayette by the great British abolitionist Thomas Clarkson. The original statement goes like this. I would never have drawn my sword in the cause of America if I could have conceived that thereby I was founding a land of slavery. This is something Lafayette would have said in private. He would not have said it in public, but it really made an impression on me and started my investigation of Lafayette and his anti-slavery work. The next slide illustrates the essay by Professor John Stouffer, who, by the way, is writing a book as we speak on Charles Sumner, and it's of Charles Sumner, one of the abolitionists that Lafayette influenced. And he considers Lafayette's influence on Sumner to be super important. And he points to the speech that Sumner gave at Cooper Union in November of 1860 called, and was later published in pamphlet form, Lafayette the Faithful One. And this speech is so important because it was Sumner's effort to push the Republicans to stay true to the cause and not to give up in the face of the Southern secessionist movement. And several states at that time had stated they were seceding or about to secede from the Union. The next slide is a second essay that Lloyd wrote for the book, Lafayette, Napoleon, and the Struggle for Women's Rights. The painting is of Madame de Stael, one of Lafayette's friends, whom he supported as she supported him. And one interesting note about Madame de Stael, and I think Lloyd might agree with it, is that she had an even more fraught relationship with Napoleon than Lafayette did. He basically banished her and wouldn't let her come back to France and banned her books and the like. The next slide illustrates Diane Shaw's essay, Envoy of the Great Spirit, Lafayette's relationship with Native Americans. Diane chose this wonderful lithograph of Mohango, one of the Osage Indians whom Lafayette helped out in Europe in the late 1820s. And her essay covers Lafayette's relationship starting in the American Revolution with Native Americans. So the next slide, and we'll do this very quickly, this is the group of presenters in the front row, the two that you probably will not recognize, maybe three. But the one man on the left is Philip Eliasov. And then the third from the left is Professor John Stouffer. And the last gentleman is the Dean of Students at Fairfield University. And the last slide, and we're very proud of the back cover. And this has a quote from Stanley Azerta, which appeared, it's the first line of an essay he wrote in 1989 for the Queen's University catalog. And it kind of says it all, in my opinion. Lafayette knew only one cause during his long lifetime, human liberty. And the image is one that I first saw when Diane Shaw shared it with me, and it's pretty much my favorite image of the older Lafayette by Rembrandt Peale. So I'm going to turn briefly to my essay and make 6 quick points about Lafayette and his anti-slavery advocacy. First, he did not emerge from his education and early life as a full-fledged abolitionist. There was an evolution. When he arrived in South Carolina in June of 1777, he was at best obtuse. He wrote this to his wife: "In America, there are no paupers or even the sort of people we call peasants. Every individual has an adequate amount of property, a considerable number of Negroes, and the same rights as the most powerful proprietor of the land." Second, it was likely that Lafayette's experience with African American soldiers during the American Revolution was the thing that led him to see both their humanity and the humanity of their race. This included his relationship with the first Rhode Island Regiment, composed of enslaved blacks and Native Americans under a white commander, which in 1778 came under his command in Rhode Island after the failed invasion of Aquidneck Island. And again, they came under his command during the siege of Yorktown. In April of 1824, when he met with the free men of color who had fought with Jackson during the War of 1812, Lafayette specifically referred to the African Americans who had served in the war. Quote, "I have often during the War of Independence seen African blood spilled with honor in our ranks for the cause of the United States." There was also his relationship with James, an enslaved man who served as a double agent in Cornwallis's camp during the Virginia campaign in 1781 and provided Lafayette with important intelligence. After James, as you probably know, he applied for his freedom to the Virginia legislature. Lafayette wrote a testimonial. He was finally able to obtain his freedom in 1787. And in honor of Lafayette, he took his surname for his own. And he's known as James Lafayette, or some people say James Fayette. Third, clearly by the end of 1784 and even before, Lafayette's position as an anti-slavery advocate had matured. It was during his travels with James Madison that fall, during his first victory lap in America, that he told Madison that one of his 3 hobby horses, i.e. obsessions in politics, was the manumission of slaves. Previously, in February of 1783, he had written Washington that they should buy a plantation together in America, quote, "to try the experiment to free the Negroes and use them only as tenants." And this would, in Lafayette's mind, serve as an example to others. And of course, we know that he did just that in Cayenne. Fourth, Lafayette's belief that slavery was evil and it should be abolished was deeply held, and this cause was very important to him. This is illustrated by a remarkable postscript in a letter he wrote to his wife's relative, Madame Dehenine, from prison in Magdeburg in March of 1793. Lacking information about the status of his wife and children in revolutionary France, he wrote, and I quote, "I do not know what has happened to my plantation in Cayenne, but I hope that my wife will see to it that the blacks who farm it preserve their freedom." Fifth, Lafayette was a consistent supporter of this cause from the time he embraced it until his death. His actions during the farewell tour show this. His visit to the African Free School in Manhattan, the embrace of James Lafayette at Yorktown, his meetings with African Americans in many cities, his documented debates with Jefferson and Madison, his sending of an anti-slavery pamphlet to his friend Chief Justice John Marshall all illustrate this. Finally, Lafayette had a posthumous influence on the abolitionists like Wendell Phillips and Charles Sumner. He, in the antebellum period, he was the most popular public figure in America, and the abolitionists used his example and his work to advance their cause. Thank you.
Well done, Alan. Thank you very, very much. And we'll have some Q&A later in the program, so everybody can ask Alan some questions if you like. So please know that that is coming up. Now, next, we have Diane Shaw. Let me get her spotlighted. Bear with me 1 second. Okay, let's see. Let me get you, Diane. Front and center. Here we go. All right, ladies and gentlemen, the lovely Diane Shaw.
Thank you, Chuck. I am delighted to be here, as I said earlier, and it's been wonderful to be a part of this whole program, beginning with the symposium at Fairfield. And I'd like to say a word of thanks to Fairfield for their sponsorship of the symposium and for the wonderful venue that they provided. And a very special thank you to Susan Joy and Mark Minker for making this publication possible. One of the things I think I will always remember the reception in Fairfield, and I'm not sure if it was an official uh, uh, reception sponsored by the college or sponsored by groups in the area. I'm not sure, but it was wonderful. It was held in sort of a rustic building, and there were people were in period costume, and there was period music. And I assure you that I do not usually feel transported in time, but it truly felt like it was 1824. It was a wonderful feeling. Um, but as for my presentation on Lafayette's relationship with Native Americans, it was extremely exciting to do the research and extend some of the things we already knew and uncover new aspects of this remarkable relationship. I will just highlight a few items from one of the several stories that are sort of embedded in my text. I was extremely fascinated by the story of Peter Otsaket, who was the young half French, half Oneida young man that Lafayette met at Fort Stanwix in 1784 and invited back to France to live with the Lafayette family. It was interesting to me that his family was reluctant to send him. I think, possibly a little nervous about this. And so it was a year or so before he was able to go. He did spend 3 years in France, but he was very eager to get back home to America. And apparently he cut quite a swath upon his return, according to accounts in the source In the Words of Women, which is online, but I believe is also a book. And there are fascinating stories in there about a young woman who met him in a carriage, um, which I believe she said there were three young people, and there was an old Quaker, there was an Indian chief, and herself, and they became friends, and she invited him to come to an event, and he danced for them, and it's kind of wonderful details, sort of first person details. Um, and the most interesting bit to me was the fact that Peter Otsaket, this young man, was one of the 51 chiefs and warriors invited to Philadelphia to meet with George Washington in 1792. And on their way, the delegation stopped in Bethlehem, where they had a remarkable encounter with the students of the Moravian Female Seminary. That encounter, I'm just now starting to give tours for the Moravian Church in Bethlehem, where I live, because we were accorded uh, World Heritage status, and we're ramping up our tours. And I tell people the story of the meeting of the young women of the seminary and the chiefs and warriors, And we have wonderful records of what they said to each other, and people are invariably asking me for copies of what they said. And so Peter Otsuket was one of those chiefs and warriors. And what is really tragic is that he did make it to Philadelphia. They went to Philadelphia in a couple of days later, and he died, possibly of pleurisy. But his death was very celebrated in Philadelphia. 10,000 people attended his funeral. Um, it's really quite remarkable. Um, I also was really interested in where he was buried, and I was able to determine that he was buried in the cemetery of the Second Presbyterian Church, which that church closed, and the cemetery was closed. And those graves, some 2,500 graves of people from the Revolutionary era, ended up in the Mount Vernon Cemetery in Philadelphia, which I plan to visit at some point soon. Um, so, and the final piece on Peter Otsuket, Lafayette actually met his son during the farewell tour. This young man actually jumped into the canal boat that Lafayette was riding on the Erie Canal and introduced himself as the son of Peter Otsuket. So I think it's an incredible story. And there are other incredible stories about Lafayette and Native Americans, and I won't go into detail, but I'm going to hold up a book here. If you can see this again, here's this wonderful image of Mohango, the or sacred son, the Osage woman that Lafayette helped uh, get home to France after they were sort of left. The six Osage were left wandering in Paris, but their sponsors kind of dropped away. Mohango was the mother of this child, and actually she had given birth to twins on this journey in Europe, and the other twin had been adopted by a woman in Belgium, and I don't think the child lived long. But at any rate, the story of the Osage and Lafayette's role in helping them get home is also fascinating. And this book about the Osage is new, or 2013 or so. But what it does is it reprints the three books that were written about these Osage visitors to France, and so you have there is a lot to take in. But I will stop there and turn it over to Lloyd for more interesting things.
Thank you very much, Diane. I really appreciate you joining us today. Fascinating stuff. And the Lafayette's relationship to the Native Americans is obviously very important to us. And I can't thank you enough for presenting. And we look forward to seeing you in Paris in April with Lloyd and Alan. And we'll talk about that a little more later. In the meantime, I have Lloyd Kramer here. Lloyd, let me make sure I get you spotlighted up and so everybody can see you real well. Bear with me 1 second. Here we go. There we go. Lloyd, you're up, brother.
Hi, and thank you. I have the book right here, and I just want to say again my appreciation to Fairfield University for hosting this event, and especially my appreciation for Jan O'Sullivan's work in helping to bring this into print. As Alan mentioned, I had two chapters in the book. One is about the changing historical reputation of Lafayette and how he's viewed somewhat differently in France and in the United States. And Robert Kraut's essay also addresses this issue. So I'm not actually going to focus on that chapter, but I'm going to say a few things about the chapter that focuses on his relationships with women. Because I think that Lafayette's historical significance for our own time comes from his general defense of human rights, including the efforts to abolish slavery that Alan talked about, and his affirmation of Native Americans that Diane talked about. But he was also notable because of his opposition to the authoritarianism of Napoleon Bonaparte, and because of his advocacy for the public role of creative, independent, and politically active women. So I want to stress his relationship with three women in the last years of his life. This is what my essay is about. In the last couple of decades of his life, Germaine de Stael, whose image we've seen already this evening, who was a leader of the resistance to Napoleon's authoritarianism, Frances Wright, who was a Scottish woman and an active abolitionist who became active in the abolitionist campaign in America, and Christiana Belgiojoso, who was an advocate for national independence in Italy. And I'm just going to say a few things about each of these people, but my overall point is that Lafayette was an exceptional male political leader who promoted public respect for independent women and encouraged women to express their political and cultural ideas in the public sphere. And in this respect, he was a path-breaking leader. He wasn't unique, but he was one of the leaders in saying women must be part of the public conversation. And these patterns all appeared in his relationships with Germaine de Stael, Frances Wright, and Christina Belgiojoso. The interesting thing about these women is that they had similarities to Lafayette's own life story. They all defied social conventions. They all crossed national borders, like Lafayette, to act upon their ideas and ambitions. And they all affirmed human rights, the right of women and others to be free and independent participants in the public sphere. And this is a theme that makes Lafayette's support for these women permanently important and relevant to our own time. And I think Lafayette's relationships with women very much enriched his political and cultural life because they deepened his understanding of human experience. But I should note that his deep relationships with women began, of course, with Adrienne, his wife, and they had a very close friendship as well as a marriage. And the story of Lafayette's respect for strong women actually begins with his respect for Adrienne. But her death at age 48 in 1807 was a devastating loss for Lafayette. And in the years that followed, he began developing relationships with equally strong women and independent women. But I want to note that his relationship with Germaine de Stael, which was the first of these three relationships, was closely connected to his resistance to Napoleon Bonaparte. Because as Alan mentioned, Napoleon had banished Germaine de Stael from France because of her critical writings. Lafayette began writing to Germaine de Stael to affirm his support for her novels and for her political critiques of Napoleon. Now, this is interesting because Lafayette's own relationship with Napoleon was very complicated. He had actually been freed from prison because of Napoleon's intervention in a treaty with the Austrians in 1797. Lafayette, therefore, eventually got back to France because of that freedom. He at first thought he might work with Napoleon, but within a year or two after he returned to Lagrange, he realized that Napoleon was moving in an authoritarian direction. He thought only of his own power and influence. So Lafayette became critical of Napoleon's authoritarianism. And he defended human rights, Lafayette did, while Napoleon repressed them. And I like to say that Napoleon became a dictator and Lafayette became a farmer. It's a very striking contrast. But Lafayette had to be very careful in the way he criticized Napoleon because he did not want to be sent into exile like Germaine de Stael. So Lafayette wrote to Germaine de Staël and supported her throughout his period of internal exile while she was in external exile. Germaine de Staël was also from the upper class in France. He had known her father, Jacques Necker, and her mother, Suzanne, and they had a long-standing relationship. But I simply want to stress that Germaine de Staël was for Lafayette a model of resistance to authoritarianism, and Lafayette was for Germaine de Staël a model of steadfast support for the principles of liberty and human rights. They admired each other, affirmed each other, and supported each other. Their personal and political lives converged. This same pattern shows up in his relationship with Frances Wright, who he always called Fanny. Fanny Wright reached out to Lafayette after she published a book about America. She joined him at Lagrange in the early 1820s. They became very close friends as advocates of human rights and liberal political institutions and self-government. And they became so close that when Lafayette was invited to go to America in 1824, he decided he couldn't make the trip without Fanny Wright. And so she followed him a couple of weeks later and accompanied him on the trip during much of the early part of the trip, and then later kind of veered off and ended up in Tennessee, where she started an anti-slavery experiment to purchase enslaved people, like Lafayette had tried to do in Guyana, in Cayenne. And Lafayette continued to support her, even though their personal contacts declined during the last part of the trip, and he only saw her a couple more times when she returned to France. But once again, Lafayette became the steadfast advocate of a woman who was attacked by others, ridiculed for others, and paid a price for her political views. And finally, he befriended Cristina Belgiojoso, who was an exile from Italy, who fled to France. She came from an upper-class family. She was persecuted by the Austrians because she was an advocate for Italian independence from Austria. She met French liberals who introduced her to Lafayette. Lafayette became her great advocate, supported her writing, her campaign for national independence of Italy. And she, Cristina Belgiojoso, was with Lafayette often in the last year of his life. She was his closest female friend outside of his family to the very last months of his life. So Lafayette's women friends were all exceptional women with transnational commitments to human rights and with a determination to promote their ideas in the public sphere. And I think Lafayette's career cannot be understood without recognizing the relevance of his opposition to authoritarianism and his support for independent-minded women. And so this leads in conclusion to the overall argument of our book. Why is this book a contribution to the study and discussion of Lafayette? And the argument is that Lafayette is still an important historical ally and friends for Americans in our own time. During the American Revolution, he came to America, served the cause as both a Continental Army general and as an advocate for the French-American alliance. During the tour of 1825, he came back and affirmed the value of the American national experiment and the republic that was trying to promote democracy. In the third phase of this relationship after his death, his defense of human rights and his opposition to slavery was often invoked by abolitionists. He was a major ally of people like Charles Sumner and Wendell Phillips in the struggle to abolish slavery. During the First World War, when the Americans went to France to join the war against the German Empire, Again, Lafayette was a key historical friend and historical ally, even though he was deceased, who was interpreted as an advocate of democracy and as a key figure in a war that was designed to make the world safe for democracy. And so at Lafayette's grave, they said, Lafayette, we are here. And now, in the 21st century, in our own time, Americans need Lafayette again. We need a historical friend and ally who advocated for democracy, opposed authoritarianism and imperialism, and defended human rights. The values of America's founding fathers, Lafayette's generation, are now at the greatest risk in the United States since the Civil War. And so our new book affirms why Lafayette's values and actions still matter in these dangerous times. And so we say, Lafayette, we are here.
Thank you, Lloyd. Thank you very, very much. I really appreciate that. That was fantastic. You're getting a round of applause here. I'm going to unspotlight you and let everybody see each other here. A couple of things. For those of you, and we've sold many of these books, and for those of you that haven't bought a book and you're an AFL member, in your inbox as we speak is a way to purchase this book. I did that while Lloyd was speaking, so look for that in your inbox. And the proceeds of the sale of this book help the American Friends of Lafayette. So thank you very much. These three people, amongst many others, will be also at a symposium in Paris in April. Look for an email next week about visiting Paris and seeing this symposium. We're very excited about it. Details forthcoming. Now I'd like to open it up for questions. Do you guys know how to raise your hand? I'm not talking literally, but with the screen, there's a way to react, the react button, and has a raise hand there. You can see, I just raised my hand. You can see my hand in the upper left-hand corner, or you can chat, or you can just yell it out. But I've got Alan, Diane, and Lloyd ready to answer any questions you might have. Let's see, who else raised their hand? Let's see here. Andrew, I'm going to ask you to unmute, and you can ask your question.
Hi there, how are you? Andrew Stevenson. I'm from Washington, D.C. I work at the State Department. So I had a bit of a question about sort of international relations and how we can take some inspiration from a lot of what you've talked about tonight. I've read a bit about Manuel Torres and Simón Bolívar, of course, who was, around in that time period when the independence movements were so large in the region. So I guess my question is, what sort of inspiration can we sort of take from Lafayette in the current moment, whether that's in terms of Latin America, which is sort of my area of expertise, or the U.S. relationship with Europe and France. Thank you very much.
Who's going to take that on?
No taker?
Well, I will just say very briefly that Lafayette had respect for Bolivar. Bolivar had great respect for Lafayette. I think Bolivar even ended up with some pistols from Lafayette. Is that correct, Alan?
Well, through the intercession of one of the Custuses, George Washington Parke Custis, they sent him, I think, a portrait of Washington, and I think it was Washington's pistols as well. Lafayette signed the letter. He was involved with that.
But I would just make the additional point that Lafayette always strongly advocated for the national independence and autonomy and sovereignty of each nation, and his conception of human rights was national sovereignty as well as individual rights. And it's always complicated to think about how our own role in the world can replicate either or both of those goals at the same time.
Thank you, Lloyd. Anything you want to add, Diane, at all?
No, that's great. Thank you, Lloyd.
Okay. Next, we have a question from John Schiffert. John, are you there? Can you unmute yourself?
Yes, thank you. I am the representative of St. Peter's Lutheran Church in Lafayette Hill, Pennsylvania, which is the center point for the skirmish that was Lafayette's first independent command in the War of Revolution. And first, I'm very thankful to the American Friends of Lafayette for having helped us put on a couple of events the last couple of years in honor of the bicentennial. I've got a question specifically for Diane regarding Native Americans. The force that Lafayette led, which was a significant portion of of Washington's army, included somewhere between, depending on who you listen to, 50 or 100 Oneida scouts. And I'm curious, Diane, if you have any particular insight into that particular aspect of what is euphemistically called the Battle of Barren Hill. We do know that 6 of the Oneida Scouts fell during the skirmish and are buried in our cemetery. And I was curious if you had any insight or any more information in terms of who they were, any information about them.
Yeah. Thank you for that good question. And, I think that the most recent book on that topic is The Forgotten Allies, the Oneidas, Our Forgotten Allies. And that gives, I don't know if you've seen that book, but that gives a lot of background on that event at Barren Hill. And also, one of the things I was unable to determine, and in my essay, you'll see that whether it was 4 or 6 Oneidas who perished. I waffled and I just said between 4 and 6.
I've seen both numbers given.
Yeah, lost their lives. It would be interesting to have that confirmed. But I have been in that cemetery, and that is very moving to be there. And of course, that was, Lafayette could have gotten into bad trouble there, but fortunately, he had help from the Oneidas, and I understand that the crossing of I guess it was the Schuylkill, was really dangerous. And, the last group to go were the Oneidas who held back. And, so they really, I think, helped save the day for Lafayette.
Oh, yes. That's everything that I've seen has indicated that. Now, one thing is interesting. I've seen one of the Oneida that is buried in the cemetery identified as being a Thomas Sinovis. Now, obviously, that's not his original name. But he is identified as a sachem, as a peace sachem, as someone fairly significant. And I'm curious if that's a name that you're familiar with, if you've ever heard of him.
I'm not, but that bears some further research.
I will look into that book, though. That's very interesting. I did not know about that. Thank you.
Oh, right. Forgotten Allies by, let's see, I have it. Let's see, is that right here?
Martin.
Well, I thought I had it right here.
I think it's Joe Blathar.
It's by James Kirby Smith and
Joe Blathar.
Yeah, thank you. Is that your colleague, Lloyd? Yes, from Chapel.
James Kirby Martin.
James Kirby Martin, exactly.
Yeah.
Forgotten Allies.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Our next question comes from our presenter in the speaker series on January 21st, past president of the American Friends of Lafayette, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Robert Kraut. Robert, will you unmute?
Yeah, can you hear me?
I can hear you, sir.
Okay, I had a further answer to Andrew Stevenson's question about Lafayette and Latin America, and that is that Lafayette was very much taken by James Monroe's remarks that become known as the Monroe Doctrine. And it was this idea that Lafayette spent the rest of his life supporting democratic movements in Latin America, Mexico and southward. And not only that, but he encouraged business from United States citizens, from Europeans to go to Latin America and create, again, what he called a free trade market. In other words, the walls, the economic walls would be lowered. And also, he was very concerned about European adventures in South America, but he certainly did not support the idea that the United States would then have a controlling role over Latin America. It was rather the idea of an open partnership between Latin American democratic forces and the United States, and Europeans who were interested in liberal and democratic and Republican causes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robert. That was very helpful, and I'm sure Andrew and everybody else appreciated that. Thank you. And we look forward to you presenting on Wednesday, January 21st. And Robert's subject is very interesting to me. He's going to talk about two tours that Lafayette did that we have not really talked about. One would be the tour he did in our United States in 1784, and then the tour he did in France in 1829. So we're looking forward to having Robert Kraut then. After that, we have Donald Ryan on February 3rd, talking about Bunker Hill. Richard Ingram on February 12th, Why Lafayette Matters Today. Paul Spalding on February 24th on the Lafayette Incarcerated. And then our TV star Iris DeRode will be on at March 11th. And then we've decided we're going to interview each of our interpreters, Mark Schneider on March 24th, Michael Halbert on April 16th, and on April 28th, Ben Goldman. And speaking of interpreters, I've been trying to chat with him. He has not been paying attention, so he's about to get spotlighted without him realizing it. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Roy Wolf. Roy Wolf will be our Lafayette in 2027. Roy will be interpreting Lafayette for us as a young man, as Lafayette first steps on American soil in Charleston in Georgetown on June 13th, 1777. And we'll be celebrating the 250th anniversary of this event. Roy will be our Lafayette for that day, and the subsequent days follow, including the Battle of Brandywine, where I'll be shooting Roy in the leg. And I just want to congratulate Roy. He's been admitted to William and Mary College, so congratulations on that, Roy. And Roy was also given an award by Mount Vernon. What was that award, Roy?
That was the Mount Vernon Prize for Excellence in Civics and History in honor of Dr. Jennifer London.
Well, thank you very much, Roy. And give us a little French. Give us a little French for us, would you please?
Bonsoir. Alors, c'est un plaisir absolument pour encadrer ce personnage magnifique de l'histoire.
Thank you so much, Roy. We look forward to seeing you next year. And Roy will be Roy's fife and drum will be leading us in the parade, and the George Washington birthday parade in Alexandria, Virginia on February 14th. Thank you, Roy. Any other questions from anybody in the crowd here?
Yeah.
Pierre, did you have a question?
Yeah. Lafayette and Napoleon III and Latin America.
What's the question?
What were the relationship between Lafayette and Napoleon III at the beginning? I think there was a relationship between them because Lafayette kind of welcomed him and the Tuileries, saying this is the new president of the Republic, and then Napoleon III flipped and became an emperor, took all power. But also Lafayette was involved with Napoleon III, I think, in Latin America, in trying to promote freedom for those countries. Is that true?
Well, I am not the historian of this organization, but I'm going to ask somebody that might be. Alan Hoffman, can you answer that question?
Well, I'm pretty. Napoleon III was elected in 1848 Lafayette had been long dead.
Oh,
He died in 1834. Now, it's conceivable Napoleon III knew George Washington Lafayette, George Washington, the son. George Washington Lafayette died in 1848, but he, of course, was in France at that time, and he was in the Chamber of Deputies. So,
Thank you,
that's,
Alan. Robert, did you want to add something?
Yes, Pierre. Of course, Louis Napoleon had an older brother, Napoleon Louis.
yeah.
Two of them were involved in an effort to create a republic in Italy, and the both of them came down with the measles, and the older brother died, and at that point, Louis Napoleon was very much caught up with liberal ideas. Of course, in the afterward period, you'll recall that he became much more authoritarian, but he still maintained some of those liberal beliefs because, again, his rule as Napoleon III, even though it was considered as an authoritarian role, it did involve liberal political ideas, which is why it's known to historians as the liberal empire. So, in other words, he was somewhat influenced by Lafayette.
Yeah, I don't know.
I would just like to say I hope Napoleon III didn't take too much from Lafayette because he became quite an authoritarian and overthrew the Republic. He did at the very end become a bit more liberal, but not in the early phase. So, but the key point would be I think that there was no significant relationship between Lafayette and Napoleon III, but
Mhm.
there was a complicated relationship between Lafayette and Napoleon I.
Very
Okay.
complicated. Thank you
Yeah.
very much, Pierre. That was a good question. Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Lloyd, and thank you, Alan. Anybody else, any last minute questions, any last minute things? We're coming up on the 1 hour mark, and I know a lot of us have, things to do. Diane, Alan, Lloyd, did you want to say anything to wrap up? Okay, well, I'll say it.
Well,
Buy the book, ladies and gentlemen.
I,
Free shipping.
I think
Look at
we
it's in your
already,
inbox. Okay. It's very worthwhile. It's a great read, and I really learned a lot. And I thought I knew everything about Lafayette until I read this book. So thank you very much.